Welcome to Exploration and Analysis and the next installment of our presidential election series. I had done videos on the 1992 election and 1996 election, and I will link those videos in the description below. So today's episode is going to be about the 2000 presidential election, and I'm going to be dividing 2000 into two different parts because I think that there's enough content there to warrant two videos. We're going to have primaries in both parties, and we're going to have very tumultuous general election results, which you may very well know about. And so there's a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. So brace yourself for this discussion, exploring and analyzing the 2000 presidential election. So I'm going to start things off here a little bit differently and talk about how during every election I'll size up the candidates and try to decide whether or not I think the American people will find them appealing. So in order to do that, I look at a lot of things. I look at their experience, their expertise, their speaking abilities, and their general likability, the old would you like to have a beer with them question. So there's been many times where we've had presidential candidates that have come along and they scored pretty highly on my initial assessment of them, and I thought that I could really see this person doing well in the presidential election. But then it turns out that they don't do so well. They don't catch fire. They don't gain momentum. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't seem like they do as well as I thought that they had the potential to do. And some of the candidates that maybe fit that is Evan Bayh, Jim Webb, Bill Richardson. We'll talk about John Kasich a little bit later. These are all people that I thought had certain good qualities of, whether it be their resume or their likability or their speaking skills. I thought that they could be strong candidates, and for whatever reason, they just didn't end up, hitting it and gaining that momentum. But then there's George W. Bush, and I have to admit, I had a very different take on him. And spoiler alert, George W. Bush is going to end up winning this election at the end. And when I initially sized him up, I got to admit, I did not expect him to do well. Certainly not nearly as well as he did. Um, when I looked at those different things, I just didn't really see it. I didn't really see how the American people would support him. I didn't really find, his qualities, to be those that the American people would find appealing. He didn't have much of a resume. He didn't seem to have much expertise on the issues. He wasn't particularly well spoken, and frankly, I thought his personality was rather bland. He wasn't really somebody that I'd want to have a beer with necessarily. And in 2000, people didn't really use the term nepo baby. Certainly, I didn't, but he probably kind of fit that description. I mean, his best things he had going for him were his name and his family connections, but even that was rather suspect. Remember, his father had been voted out of office rather unceremoniously 8 years earlier with only 37.5% of the vote, leaving office as a rather unpopular president. So with all this in mind, I didn't really see Bush as a contender. And we know when he emerged, there certainly was a lot of buzz about him. He quickly became the front runner, but I didn't buy it. I didn't think, he would continue to do well. And even as he did indeed continue to do well, he continued to be the front runner. He continued to have high poll ratings. I continue to think to myself, gee, I just don't think he's going to win. I can't see him winning. Somebody's going to come along and beat him. I don't know who that person will be. At different points, it seemed like it could be several different people, but nevertheless, Bush stayed strong. So obviously, I was wrong in my assessment. And I think as we kind of examine this video and look at it, I think that there's a certain thing that, obviously he had something that connected with people and that American people did indeed like, even if it was not something that I saw. I seem to have missed something. So, certainly I, would encourage people to put their comments down in the description. What do you think it was about Bush that maybe I missed initially that caused him to do so well? I'll speculate a little bit later about that, but I'd be interesting to hear and read what different people think about that. So, obviously there'd be other candidates that would run, and we're going to be talking about them as well, and some of their strengths and weaknesses, and why eventually they just didn't seem to have the ability to connect with people enough to win and beat Bush in this election. So where we left off in our 1996 video, Bill Clinton is going to win that election. He'll win re-election and serve a second term. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the events of that second term. And one of the big events was the impeachment. So Bill Clinton had been embroiled in several scandals, as we mentioned in the earlier two videos. And these scandals went back to 1992 and earlier. And an independent counselor named Ken Starr was brought in initially to investigate the Whitewater scandal, but eventually he's going to pivot and start looking into the Paula Jones sexual harassment allegation. So you may recall that Paula Jones had been a former Arkansas government employee who had accused Bill Clinton of propositioning her when he was governor of Arkansas. So this brought Ken Starr to ask Bill Clinton about a sexual relationship that he was said to have had more recently with another underling, this one being a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. There had been rumors that there had been a sexual relationship between them, and I guess Ken Starr was looking to see a pattern. Did Bill Clinton often engage in these sorts of sexual encounters with underlings? So it seemed shocking to people at first. Would a sitting president have a sexual relationship with an intern? I think that a lot of people didn't think he would dare do such a thing, but as it turned out, and Bill Clinton was brought in and asked about it, and he initially denied it, but over time, the truth came to a front, and he admitted that he had indeed misled the grand jury under oath, and so this created an additional scandal. So the House of Representatives is going to end up impeaching Bill Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice. The perjury part would be lying under oath, and the obstruction of justice part would be when White House staff members tried to get Monica Lewinsky to be uncooperative with Ken Starr's questionings. So after the 1998 midterm election, the Senate is going to vote against removing Bill Clinton from office. So remember, the House votes to impeach, and you just need a majority for that part. And then the Senate then votes to remove, and it requires 2/3 of the Senate to remove the president from office. But there were only 50 senators that voted to remove on the perjury part of the impeachment. So I would have to say that the American people did not support the impeachment, and polls showed that they believed that Ken Starr and the Republicans had overreached in their efforts to both investigate and impeach the president. And yet, having said that, I think that there was something of a feeling amongst the American people that Bill Clinton's ethics left something to be desired, as there seemed to be questionable behavior from him repeatedly. And, as he initially sort of denied a lot of these scandals, as certain more and more things started to come to light, and then he started to admit to certain things, I think a lot of people then started to believe more and more of that earlier stuff that maybe they had given him the benefit of the doubt. And particularly when we talk about sexual harassment, a lot of progressives might be inclined to normally believe the accusers, but when Paula Jones initially made her accusations, progressives didn't necessarily default to that, and they didn't necessarily believe her. They were a little bit skeptical. They gave Clinton the benefit of the doubt. But then once this scandal with Lewinsky broke out, and we see him having an affair with another underling, it would be an intern that worked, as several layers obviously below the president, then it's like, okay, now it's sort of easier to believe that maybe Paula Jones might have been telling the truth. So I think a lot of Bill Clinton's supporters, while they still might have supported him as president, they had some misgivings about his ethics and his personal behavior. So now let's talk about the 1998 midterms. Now, typically a president loses seats in the midterms, and we saw in the 1994 midterms, the Democrats had lost a lot of seats. So now we're in the sixth year of Bill Clinton's two terms, and typically in a 6-year, presidents will lose even more seats. But in this case, it's an exception. So this is basically after the House had voted to impeach, the Democrats actually gained seats in the House. And in the Senate, it breaks even. Basically, there were 3 states that had Republican senators in those seats that then became Democrat, and vice versa. 3 states that had Democrats as senators then had Republicans winning. And if we look at those 6 races, I think that there really isn't a national trend. I think it's fair to say that each of those 6 races had local things that were kind of unique to those states. So we had two former popular governors elected to Senate seats. So we had Evan Bayh, who was a popular governor of Indiana and the son of a former senator. He will end up winning the Senate seat there. And we have John Voinovich in Ohio, who had been a popular governor there, replacing the Democrat John Glenn for that seat. Then we have in Kentucky, we had a baseball Hall of Famer Jim Bunning winning the Senate seat there. In North Carolina, we're going to have a very charismatic Democrat named John Edwards emerge, and a very skilled politician. He's going to win that seat there. And in Illinois, we're going to see a not so popular Democrat, Carol Moseley Braun, who was embroiled in some of her own scandals, lose her seat. And in New York, we're going to see a very Democratic state that had been voting for Republican Alphonse D'Amato, but this time D'Amato is going to be facing Chuck Schumer, a future majority leader and obviously a very skilled politician, and Schumer is going to end up beating D'Amato. So we have six races here that I think all had very specific local things going on, not so much of a national trend. So we don't see the Republicans doing well in this midterm election as maybe they had hoped to, and I think that that's going to, be a certain sign that maybe the Republicans need to regroup moving forward. So after disappointing results of those midterms, we're going to see Newt Gingrich step down as speaker. Remember, Newt Gingrich had risen to the speakership after the 1994 election. He had become something of a celebrity and was a big political figure for a while. But after these disappointing 1998 results, he's going to end up stepping down. And he had been involved in a little bit of a sex scandal of his own. And there were those that thought that maybe if they're going to be going after Bill Clinton for a sex scandal, that they shouldn't be having a speaker with his own sex scandal. So, for a little while, it looked like the Republicans were going to pick Robert Livingston to be the next speaker, but then he is going to get wrapped up in a sort of sex scandal of his own, and he's going to end up stepping down too. So next, we're going to see Dennis Hastert emerge, and he is going to become speaker. And I got to say, Dennis Hastert is somebody that was not particularly well known at the time. I kind of knew most members of Congress during this particular point in time, and I did not know who Dennis Hastert was. When I found out he was going to be speaker, I kind of was scratching my head, who's that? Now, ironically, later on, it's going to come to light that Hastert is going to have his own sex scandal, and it's actually going to be worse than any of these other sex scandals. But in the terms of the 1998 to 2000 period, we're not going to know about that yet. So that's going to be something that maybe discuss at a later date. And then in the Senate, we're going to see Trent Lott continue to be the Senate leader. He had taken over after Bob Dole had stepped down during his run for the presidency, and he is going to continue to be the Senate Majority Leader. So Bill Clinton is going to be elected in his first term in 1992 with a very bad economy, and he's going to use that bad economy as a justification why people should vote out Bush and vote for him. And in his first term, the economy is going to gradually improve, and upon him winning re-election in 1996, the economy is going to be looking a lot better. Well, that economy is going to continue to improve in his second term. So I have up on the screen there the unemployment rates of the different years of his presidency. And by unemployment rate, usually they're monthly numbers, but then we can take a year and average out those numbers. And that's what I have here. So it's going to start off with a respectable 5.4% unemployment rate in 1996. That's going to be good enough for him to win re-election. And then it's going to drop to 5%, and then to 4.5%, and then to 4.3% in 1999, and then eventually in 2000 to 4%. And I think a lot of people at the time didn't think that it was possible for the unemployment rate to get that low. A lot of times I was hearing people say that 5% was sort of full unemployment and that it couldn't get any lower than that. So that's going to defy expectations. So we're going to see a very strong economy here, which usually helps the incumbent party and the incumbent president. Now, in this case, Bill Clinton's not going to be running for re-election, but his vice president, Al Gore, is going to be the one looking to be the next president. In my earlier videos, the budgets were discussed, and the budget deficit that had existed in the early 90s was a particularly big issue. But we're going to start to see as the 90s progress, the budget is going to start to get balanced. And when you have a good economy, you have a much easier time balancing the budget. And the reason for that is you're having more people that are making money and paying more taxes, and we have less people taking advantage of programs that you tend to have more of a need for when the economy is bad. Things like food stamps or unemployment insurance or general welfare programs. There aren't as many people needing those programs when the economy is good. So government is spending less on that stuff, and it's getting more in taxes. So for that reason, and on top of that, some of the different budgets that were passed earlier in the 90s, we're going to see finally the budget be balanced. And the budget had not been balanced before this. You'd have to go back to 1969 before the budget would balance. And then after this, as we move into the 2000s, we're going to see the budget not be balanced anymore. And at this time, as I record this in 2026, we're very far away from a balanced budget. But in this period in the late 90s, we are indeed going to see a balanced budget, which was something that was seen as a very positive thing that was able to be accomplished by both the Republicans in Congress and the Clinton administration. So I thought I would, share some information about Clinton's approval ratings. My source for this would be Gallup, which was considered the premier polling firm by this point. And what I've done is I've taken numbers from January and June throughout Clinton's presidency. As we can see here, it's kind of hovering around 60%, sometimes higher, sometimes maybe a little bit lower. But that's still considered very good. I mean, I think for presidents, if they can get 55 and up, that's considered a very good number indeed. So Clinton's approval rating is going to continue to be very strong. Even during the impeachment process, it continued to be strong. And I think that the strong economy had a lot to do with that high approval rating. So let's talk a little bit about Al Gore. He is somebody who I talked a bit about in the 1992 video, but I don't think I mentioned him much in the 1996 video. Now, Al Gore obviously was Bill Clinton's running mate, and he's going to run for election here in 2000. So let's look at his career. So he had been a senator. His father had been a senator, so he was a second generation politician, and he ran for president once before in 1988 when he was fairly young, and he did pretty well for himself. I think he outperformed expectations. He won a handful of primaries that year, and so he seemed to have a decent profile. He was a popular politician, and I think that was part of the reason why Bill Clinton picked him in 1992. And something that I mentioned in that video, and maybe should mention again, when Bill Clinton did pick him, it helped the campaign quite a bit. Remember, Clinton had been mired in sort of third place at that period of time. Bush and Perot were the two front runners. They were kind of neck and neck with each other, and Bill Clinton was like 7 or 8 points behind them. But then his fortune started to change, and the first step of that was him picking Al Gore. I think that brought some energy to his campaign. Like I said, Gore was a pretty popular figure, and we see Bill Clinton's numbers improved a lot after that. Now, there would be a lot more that would happen that would cause those numbers to improve, but that first part of that was him picking Al Gore as his running mate. So it definitely was a choice that I think helped Bill Clinton politically, and I think that it said something about Gore's popularity, at least in 1992. So if we look at Clinton and Gore, and I mentioned this earlier in that video, on the surface, it seemed like they have quite a bit in common. They were both from mid-Southern states, and they both came from that wing of the Democratic Party. They might say the New South, New Democrat wing, where they weren't as ultra-conservative as some of that older generation of conservative Southern senators, but they were more moderate, but not as liberal as say people like Michael Dukakis or Walter Mondale or Hubert Humphrey. So they were kind of in between, a sort of third way of kind of moderate Democrat. And I think that they both kind of fit that description rather well. And I think it's fair to say that they agreed on most issues, although there'd be some difference in emphasis, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And they were both close in age, so they were from the same generation, born only a small amount of years apart. So a lot of Al Gore was tied to Bill Clinton, and he was indeed his vice president. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, so if the administration is popular, if the economy is doing well, if Clinton's approval rating is pretty strong, wouldn't that bode well for Al Gore? Shouldn't Al Gore then do very well in this election, win running away with it? Well, maybe, maybe not. And we'll kind of talk about why maybe Al Gore is not necessarily so tied to Bill Clinton as we might think. So there's some important differences to mention about Al Gore from Bill Clinton. Now, some of this was positive. So Al Gore was not tied to any of Clinton's scandals. So for those people who maybe thought that Bill Clinton had good policies and they liked the way the economy was going and they approved of him as president, but they didn't like his scandals, they could look at Al Gore and say, well, he's got a lot of the same policies, but he just doesn't have the scandals. He had nothing to do with Whitewater or Monica Lewinsky or Paula Jones or any of the cabinet scandals that had occurred while Bill Clinton was president, as the perjury and the obstruction of justice. Like, Al Gore didn't really have anything to do with that stuff. So, maybe Al Gore could emerge as somebody who could, take credit for some of the policies, or at least say that he's on the same team that had those policies without all the baggage associated with the scandals. Now, another thing that had come up in the prior two elections was service in Vietnam. Bill Clinton did not serve in Vietnam, and that was something that a lot of people had misgivings about, as he was looking to be commander in chief, whereas he was running against George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, who are both veterans, in those cases World War II veterans. Well, Al Gore did serve in Vietnam. He was a Vietnam veteran. It wasn't necessarily a combat role, but he could say that he was in Vietnam and he was part of the military during that war. So he definitely didn't have the baggage of somebody that could be accused of avoiding the draft. But another difference, though, and this might not be as positive, is their backgrounds. So we talked about Bill Clinton being a man of humble origins, and I think he had a way of connecting with people, a sort of plains folks kind of thing that was authentic enough that I think people could, relate to him as kind of a guy of a working class background, and maybe they could see themselves in Bill Clinton a little bit, and they could kind of see him as maybe a part of them and as part of the American experience. Whereas Al Gore had been a son of a senator, he was from a more upscale background. Maybe he came across a little bit more aloof and was not the sort of plain talking kind of person that Bill Clinton was. And I think that he had a more difficult time kind of connecting with people, especially kind of working class people. And I think that lack of skill in connecting with people, I think, is going to be a hindrance to Al Gore's efforts to get elected in his own right. And then there's going to be a different focus. Al Gore was known to focus particularly on environmental issues. He was very well known for bringing the climate change issue to the forefront of American attention, and that was popular with some people, unpopular with other people. Similarly, on tobacco, like he had sort of been pretty anti-tobacco, pretty outspoken on that issue, and maybe more so than Bill Clinton, and and also Al Gore on the technology issue. Like, he was said to be a technocrat, is a term that was used. So definitely he had a different sort of different emphasis on his issue palette than what Bill Clinton had, even if they didn't have strong disagreements about policies. So while Bill Clinton was widely popular in the country and the Republicans were fairly unpopular, some Democrats had grown very disenchanted with Clinton and his administration, particularly as it related to his scandals. And these, particularly the reform minded members of the Democratic Party, sort of the clean government types, they were starting to look for a person to seek the nomination and bring a more respectable and trustworthy image to represent the Democrats. And for a while, there were different candidates talked about that maybe play that role. There was some talk maybe of John Kerry, Howard Dean, maybe Dick Gephardt. So the idealistic Senator Paul Wellstone had been somebody that had considered running. He was somebody that was more definitely to the left of the Clinton-Gore administration, but he ended up not running. He said that he was developing back pain during that period, and decided that he couldn't do it. But the person who did step up to do it would be the Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey. So Bradley had been a figure that was well liked by the media. Certainly, he had been a former basketball player. and talked about many times as a potential presidential or vice presidential candidate, but he had never run for president, never been picked as a running mate. So, he would end up being embraced by these kind of more reform minded members of the Democratic Party who maybe had, grown rather tired of the Clinton Gore administration. So he would end up, Bill Bradley would be endorsed by Wellstone, who, like I said, decided not to run. Others that would endorse Bradley would be Pat Moynihan, another sort of clean government type guy, a Democratic senator from New York, and Bob Kerrey, who had run against Clinton in 1992, and at this point is still a senator from Nebraska. So Bill Bradley is going to be somewhat more liberal than Al Gore, but it's kind of going to depend on the issue. So, on the one hand, Bill Bradley is going to favor simplifying the tax code, which is something that's generally considered more popular amongst conservatives. But Bradley's going to have some other things that other policies that are going to be more liberal. So his healthcare plan is going to be much more liberal and progressive than what Gore is going to favor at this time. And Bradley is also going to favor stricter gun control than Al Gore will. So I think overall, I think Bradley is going to be seen as somewhat more liberal than Gore. He had voted against the welfare reform package that I had talked about in the prior video, so he had seen those restrictions on welfare to be too stringent for his liking, and he had voted against that. So a lot of people thought that Bradley might have good chances, as he had a lot of popularity. He had certainly won his elections in New Jersey with great fanfare, but he's going to end up struggling as a candidate. He's going to underperform in the debates. At times, he's going to seem rather moody and aloof, and I think that that's going to hurt his candidacy. So he's not going to end up being as successful as maybe a lot of his supporters had hoped. So now let's talk about the Republican candidates. And at first, it seemed like the Republican primary would have no clear frontrunner. In the last several elections, there had been a rather entrenched establishment figure that had been the frontrunner, and it seemed like at first that might not be the case this time. So there were a lot of candidates that expressed interest and kind of came out of the woodwork. Although a lot of those candidates would either decide not to run or at least would run but then drop out before the first primaries and caucuses. There also would be several kind of candidates that had run in 1996 that we had talked about in the last video that would decide to give it another go. And there was a certain logic in deciding to do that, because if you look at the last three Republican nominees, Reagan, the senior Bush, and Dole, they had all been people who had run at least once before and had not won the nomination the first time they ran, and then won when they ran later on. So there was some logic that the Republicans seemed to favor candidates who had run once already and would run again and perhaps win the second time around. So we're going to see some candidates that are kind of repeats from the last time who are giving it another go here. So let's first talk about Lamar Alexander, the former governor of Tennessee and education secretary. He had run in 1996, as we talked about before, and he was able to leapfrog a lot of better known and better funded candidates. So it seemed like he kind of outperformed expectations a little bit when he ran that time. And so he decides to give it another go. This time he's going to have more name recognition and the experience of running once and having connections and having certain networks and kind of knowing the system a little bit better and being able to strategize better. So he thought that maybe the second time it would be more successful. So he decided this time to stop wearing the plaid. As we looked at his plaid wearing in the 1996 election, remember when he started that campaign, it was still early 1995, and plaid was still somewhat popular amongst America at that time. So he was kind of seen as maybe somewhat hip, but over the course of 1995 and early 96, that kind of fad had kind of run its course and it stopped being popular. And certainly by 2000, it would no longer be popular. So he's going to wear more traditional politician attire and perhaps not stand out as much, but he hoped that he could still win with his focus on states' rights and some of his other ideas. But this time around, he just wasn't able to pick up the kind of traction, and he actually had lower poll numbers and lower fundraising than he did the first time around. And he's going to end up dropping out even before the Iowa caucuses happen. Steve Forbes had won two primaries in 1996 when he ran. So the wealthy magazine publisher decided to give it another go. And in 1996, his campaign had gotten off to something of a late start. Now, I had made the case in that video that the late start was actually a good thing for him because he was a fresh face after all the other candidates had been beating each other up for several months. He came in at a good time. But he thought that in this race in 2000, if he got off to an exceptionally early start, got an organization going, put his money behind Iowa in particular, and kind of organizing that caucus voter turnout operation, he could do better. He'd focus this time more on social issues. The first time it was more about economics, more about the flat tax, and he really didn't say much about social issues. But this time he's going to say, look, I'm as socially conservative as the next guy. I might not have talked about that before, but I do have those views. So he had a sophisticated ground operation in Iowa, and he hoped with this shift in focus that Iowa voters would embrace him and that he could use that caucus win to, spearhead to wins later on in the primary process. Alan Keyes is going to be back with us again. The well spoken former ambassador and hardline social conservative will give it another go, and he'll champion morality and the need for the president to use the bully pulpit to raise the issue of morals. So Keyes may be never considered a first tier candidate, but he's certainly going to liven up the debates with his fiery rhetoric, and he will appeal to a certain segment of voters. This election would be the third straight presidential election in which Pat Buchanan would run. He did win two primaries and one caucus in 1996 after outperforming expectations in 1992. But the third time presented some challenges. And let me backtrack and say that in his prior runs, he had received certain scrutiny from Jewish American groups and pro Israel groups about some of his views. And I'll talk a little bit about that. He had been against foreign aid, including all aid to Israel, and his views on the Israeli Palestinian conflict were generally more sympathetic to the Palestinians than other candidates were. So there was that, and then also prior to his campaigns, there was this issue where he criticized the process in which accused former Nazis were tried. He didn't think that there was a fair trial process, and he had spoken out against that. And so while these criticisms of his views got a certain degree of attention during his first two runs, only to a point, okay, did they get national attention. But in between his 1996 and 2000 campaign, he would write this book that dealt with World War II, which would get published. And in this book, he made the case that Britain and France would be better off if they had postponed their entry into World War II until a later point. And the idea was that if they had let Germany and the Soviet Union fight each other and weaken each other, then Britain and France could have entered the war later and been able to defeat both a weakened Germany and a weakened Soviet Union. Now, why somebody hoping to be president in 2000 would write a book about World War II with such a controversial take, it does seem like a strange decision, but maybe it wouldn't have been such a controversial decision for anybody else. But because Buchanan had this sort of tense relationship with Jewish voters, it added fuel to that fire and kind of reinforced a lot of misgivings that a lot of people had about Buchanan because of these other things. It kind of was part of that broader context. So the criticisms of Buchanan now would grow beyond just Jewish voters, including many other people, including many Republicans, and they would speak out against the book and about Buchanan himself. So after a period where Buchanan runs as a Republican and he'd be in some of the debates, he's going to struggle to raise money, and his poll numbers are not going to be as high as they had been in the prior election. So he's going to decide to withdraw from the Republican contest and actually decide to run in the Reform Party, the party that Ross Perot had started in prior to the 1996 campaign. So I'll talk more about Buchanan's run in the Reform Party in part two of this video. And then there was George W. Bush. He had been a businessman. At one point, he was the owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. And of course, he was the son of George H.W. Bush, the former president. And George W. Bush had been governor of Texas. So in 1994, he would run for the governorship and narrowly defeat Democratic incumbent Ann Richards. Ann Richards had been a polarizing figure, and a lot of people in the Republican establishment disliked her and wanted to see her beaten. And she had made some criticisms of Bush Sr. during the 1988 convention of the Democrats. So certainly a lot of Republicans wanted to see her beaten, and George W. Bush would indeed end up beating her. So he's going to comfortably win re-election in 1998 as governor, and he's going to be seen as a very pro-business governor. And he's also a born-again Christian and evangelical, which made him more palatable to social conservatives than his father had been. You know, a point I had made in the 1992 video is that George H.W. Bush was not well liked by the social conservatives. They didn't trust him. They didn't think he was one of them. They had seen him as more of a Yankee kind of Rockefeller Republican as his father, Prescott Bush, had been. So he didn't really get on with that wing of the party, but his son, George W. Bush, would get on with that wing much better. And um, so, though, one thing, though, when we talked about military service and we talked about how Clinton had not served, obviously Bush Sr. and Dole both did serve, but George W. Bush, while he was in the National Guard, at that time, the National Guard was a way to sidestep and not be in combat in Vietnam. And so, it kind of flew in the face of a lot of the criticisms that Republicans had made against Clinton. They wanted somebody with military service, and while he kind of had National Guard service at that point, the National Guard was seen as something different, as a way to kind of sidestep Vietnam. But Bush seemed to be palatable to the different wings of the Republican Party, the different conservative factions. Both the pro-business faction liked him for his policies, his low tax policies, his low regulation pro-business policies, but also the social conservatives. They saw him as one of them, as being a true blue evangelical born again Christian, which his father had not been. So I think that could explain a lot of his appeal. Dan Quayle had been vice president under George H.W. Bush, and he hoped to garner the support of former Bush enthusiasts. But with Bush's son in the race, it made it hard to do that, even though Dan Quayle had been Bush's vice president. So he is going to get the support of Bush's former chief of staff and the former governor of New Hampshire, John Sununu. And that's going to be significant. New Hampshire is an early state, and Quayle had hoped to, do well in that early state. And with Sununu's support, that did kind of give him an edge there. But a lot of the old Bush diehards, a lot of his inner circle, were not supporting Dan Quayle. They were supporting George W. Bush, who had been Bush's son. But what Dan Quayle had hoped to do, which is what George W. Bush succeeded at doing, was to not only have that base of former Bush loyalists, but also the socially conservative wing of the Republican Party. Quayle had been much more favorable to that wing of the party. He had been an outspoken critic of some of the more liberal elements of American culture, and he had won over a fair amount of social conservatives. I think that a lot of the social conservatives that were skeptical of Bush Sr., thinking that he was too much of a liberal Republican, were a lot more comfortable with Dan Quayle, at least on the issues. But the problem is that he had a combative relationship with the media, and he was prone to some gaffes. So this made Dan Quayle not the most popular vice president in the world, and he decided not to run in 1996. I think because of that reason, he had hoped to let some time pass, take some time out of the limelight. Perhaps distance would make the heart grow fonder, and that he'd have an easier time winning in 2000. But the problem is, like I said, he was going after a lane that George W. Bush was also going after, and it just seems as though Bush was more successful at winning over that lane than Dan Quayle would be. So he's going to be running for a period of time, but then decide to drop out before the Iowa caucuses, as it doesn't seem like he was able to garner enough support to warrant staying in the race, and he didn't think he could win, so he would discontinue. And John Kasich of Ohio is somebody that I had mentioned earlier. He had been the chairman of the Budget Committee in the House and was seen as something of a policy wonk. And he helped together the budgets that would end up being those balanced budgets from the mid to late 90s that I had talked about that had gone over pretty well with the American people. So he was plain spoken, and but at the same time, he was a policy wonk. So he could come off as very smart, but also he could connect with people. He could come across as humble and something of a regular guy. So he was from the important swing state of Ohio, which was always an important battleground state in this era. And the one drawback, though, it was very rare for a sitting member of the House of Representatives to be elected president. But John Kasich would point out that the one time in American history where that did happen, it was a guy from Ohio, and that would be James Garfield. So Kasich had hoped to do what Garfield had done, which is to go from being in the House of Reps to being president. And like I said, he seemed like he could be a decent candidate. Certainly experienced, knowledgeable of the issues. Now, at this point, he would not yet be governor. Later on, he would become governor of Ohio. He would run again for president. But in this particular period, he's just a member of the House. But despite having some good strengths and some good qualities, it just seems like he never seemed to catch a break during this cycle. He wasn't able to garner enough media attention. He wasn't able to raise the money and get that momentum necessary. So he wouldn't end up lasting until the Iowa caucuses. He would end up dropping out before that. And Gary Bauer would be a socially conservative political activist, and he had headed the organization called the Family Research Council. So he was an evangelical Baptist, and he played a part in organizing that wing of the Republican Party into a force that would be supportive of that party and would be galvanized. So he had never held elected office, but he had been an undersecretary of education, a kind of sub cabinet member. And he had some interesting endorsements. Some major athletes had supported him, including Reggie White and AC Green. So he had hoped to, give the social conservative a dyed-in-the-wool member of their team to vote for and, potentially, take their issues to the presidency. Elizabeth Dole would also run a campaign, and she also was somebody who did not have an elective office that she had won by, at this point in time. She had been a cabinet member, though. She had been Secretary of Transportation, and she had a lot of interesting jobs over the years, both in and out of government. She had also been president of the Red Cross, and of course, she was the wife of the 1996 presidential candidate Bob Dole and the former majority and minority leader. So Elizabeth Dole would run a fairly non-ideological campaign. She was conservative, but maybe moderate to conservative. She didn't come across as dyed in the wool conservative as some of the other candidates had been. So she did seem to have a fair amount of appeal to voters as she consistently polled in second place for a period of time. So it looked like she had some potential, but she would end up dropping out. She struggled to raise money, and even though it's rare for a candidate who is in second place to drop out, because there's always a chance that the first place candidate could falter, she is somebody who decided that she did not think that she could, last and make it, so she ended up dropping out so she could move on to other things. Orrin Hatch would also be in the race. He was a senator from Utah and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Even at this point, he had been in the Senate a while, so he was very much an entrenched establishment figure within the Republican Party. And he would later admit that he didn't think he had a great chance of winning, but kind of figured he would run and be a backup in case Bush and the other candidates faltered. So, he would be there, like I say, a pretty conservative figure. He was a Mormon, and it wasn't very common to have Mormon candidates running, and so he hoped to be the first Mormon president, but would have a difficult time gaining traction and gaining momentum, although he would stay in the race and make it to the Iowa caucus. And then there's John McCain. And McCain had been a Vietnam veteran, and he had been a POW in the Vietnam War. He had been a captor for several years in Vietnam, and was said to have been tortured during that period of time. So um, McCain had been considered a fairly conservative senator earlier in his career, at least. He was something of a protege and admirer of Barry Goldwater, and Barry Goldwater was that stalwart conservative from the 1960s, and I guess his career extended into the 70s and 80s as well. And McCain had been an ally of Ronald Reagan during his presidency, and during the 1996 campaign, he had endorsed Phil Gramm, who was considered a fairly conservative senator and presidential candidate. But in this election in 2000, as all of the other candidates are struggling to outdo each other in their conservatism, McCain's going to kind of take a different track, and he's going to, emphasize some more moderate positions that are going to kind of run counter to some of the other candidates and maybe try to take a different lane. And one of the issues that he's really going to focus on is campaign finance reform. Now, I had talked a lot in these videos about campaign finances and the importance of raising money, and that was because they had to run TV ads in order to be successful. TV was the big medium during the time, and that cost money. So candidates had to raise that money, and they had to raise money from rich individuals. And implied in that is the sense that, okay, if you're raising money from rich individuals, maybe there's a kind of quid pro quo. Maybe there's an untoward relationship where if a rich individual donates to a campaign, they're going to expect something back, and what they expect back may not be in the best interest of the general American public. So there had been laws restricting how much rich individuals could donate to campaigns, with that in mind. But there were loopholes in those laws, and those loopholes were referred to as soft money. And there were two loopholes in particular. One was that they could donate unlimited amounts of money to the parties, and then the parties could then help the campaigns, either, indirectly, but in some ways not too indirectly. And so the McCain-Feingold bill would be a bill that John McCain would sponsor along with Russ Feingold, a fairly liberal senator from Wisconsin. And one of the things they would tackle is these donations that people could make to parties, and the idea would be to regulate that. And the other piece of it was the independent groups. You could donate unlimited amounts of money to activist groups who could themselves run ads, maybe on behalf of candidates, but not part of those campaigns. So the McCain-Feingold bill sought to regulate that as well, and keep money out of politics. And I think the Republican establishment was against these ideas because at the time they were more successful at raising money than the Democrats, particularly from these kind of rich individuals and business classes. At this point in time, those that faction of America is going to be more Republican than Democrat. I'm not so sure if that would be true anymore. Now I think that the effects of something like a McCain-Feingold bill might actually hurt Democrats more than Republicans. But in 2000, where the Republicans were still favored more by the business class and by the upper classes, it certainly was something that was seen as something that could have weakened an advantage that the Republicans otherwise would have had. So this kind of caused him to bump heads with a lot of members of the Republican establishment, and why they didn't support him even within the Senate itself. He did get the endorsement of a few senators like Chuck Hagel and Fred Thompson and Mike DeWine had endorsed him, but a fair amount of senators had endorsed Bush, even though Bush was not in the Senate. And McCain had a fairly good resume, but his relationship with the Republican establishment was hurt by this. So he's going to take a somewhat more moderate lane during this campaign, even though his history wasn't so moderate. I've talked a little bit on religion as I've discussed these different politics during this time, so I thought I'd just say a little bit more about that. Religious conservatives tended to agree on political issues, but within the religious conservative movement, there were different denominations. Now, some of these voters tended to be lumpers who cared more about the stances on the issues and didn't care what denomination the candidates were. But There were exceptions to that. There were some people within certain denominations who distrusted people who belonged to other denominations, or at least would feel more comfortable with those that were in the same denomination as them. And it seemed to be the most galvanized of these different religious groups were the evangelical Baptists. So they were particularly strong in the South, although they did have strength in some of the Midwest and some of the prairie states as well. And Gary Bauer was certainly a member of that group. And earlier on in the 1988 campaign, we had Pat Robertson, who was also a diehard member of that political faction and that religious faction as well. So whoever could win over those voters would win over good chunks of states in the Republican primaries and Republican caucuses. So I think that when we have Steve Forbes, he was a member of a more mainline Protestant church. He was Episcopalian, and the Episcopalian had been that church that had actually grown out of the Church of England. But it had been historically a somewhat more conservative church, but it had gotten more liberal over the years, and is probably more liberal now than it was in 2000. But Steve Forbes would have considered himself a more conservative member of that Episcopalian church. So I think that possibly could have been acceptable to a lot of the evangelicals who were themselves conservative Protestants, even if they weren't Episcopalians, and even if they had some slight religious differences with the Episcopalians. So Bush had been a member of a mainland Protestant church. I believe he had grown up Episcopalian as well, but he had converted to being Baptist later in life. So at this point, he was a born again Christian. So I think that he was able to kind of connect with those voters. Now Buchanan and Keyes were Catholic, and so they held a lot of those same socially conservative views as the evangelical Protestants, but were of a different denomination. And Orrin Hatch, same thing. He was a Mormon and he belonged to a different denomination, but he held a lot of the same political views as a lot of these evangelical Protestants. But it seems like I think Mormons would have been the one denomination where a lot of these evangelicals would have been most skeptical. So Orrin Hatch, I think, despite having a lot of views that they would have liked, might have had a hard time winning those voters over because they kind of saw Mormons as something a little bit too different, and there was some distrust there. Now they didn't all think that, but I think some of them did, and it might have been enough to kind of keep him from garnering as much support as he otherwise would have. So Elizabeth Dole is going to drop out, and now Bush is going to become the front runner. And I want to say some things about him in that the status as front runner, and kind of look at the 1992 race. And there's some odd, um, ironic things in that comparison because that year you had the elder Bush running against Bill Clinton, and there were some concerns that Republicans had about Bill Clinton that they raised his lack of military experience, his lack of foreign policy expertise, and perhaps potential past substance use. Ironically, in this 2000 election, all of those criticisms against Bill Clinton could potentially been levied against George W. Bush. And to hammer that point home, there was a point in which an interviewer had asked George W. Bush to name certain foreign leaders around the world, and he had really struggled to do that, which reinforced a lot of concerns people had about his foreign policy expertise. And his father had been such a respected foreign policy expert, but that was really not passed on at this point to his son, who seemed to struggle with a lot of these foreign policy issues during interviews and during debates. And similarly, like I said, there were some rumors that he had battled alcoholism in the past, and potential cocaine use, and a lot of those struggles might have what caused him to become a born again Christian. So there was talk about those things, and again, Republicans had expressed a lot of concern about Bill Clinton because he had dabbled with marijuana, and admitted to that during his 1992 campaign, and now we have George W. Bush with some of those same issues. And I had talked a little bit earlier about the military background, about Bush perhaps not having the military service that Dole or his father had had. Now in John McCain, they had somebody who did have pretty good foreign policy expertise as a member of the Senate. He had been in the Foreign Relations Committee and did, have a lot of experience there. He had also served in the military. So the Republicans had the opportunity to vote for somebody where those concerns didn't exist. And again, if they were so concerned about that with when Bill Clinton was the candidate, perhaps they might be concerned again with Bush as the candidate. So McCain is going to, make a play for this nomination and use some of those arguments. Also, Steve Forbes is going to be in the mix and hope to do well in some of these early states to get the momentum needed. So the question arises is what strategy could they have? Both Forbes and McCain were not the front runners. They were both kind of battling for second place, hoping to catch fire somewhere and kind of gain some momentum. So Forbes, like I said, is going to have an organization in Iowa that's pretty well funded, and he's going to hope that his pivot to more social issues is going to lead him to success there. Now, McCain, on the other hand, is going to look at his chances in Iowa and think that maybe they're not so good. His poll numbers are not as good there. He doesn't have the kind of ground operation that Forbes has. Whereas in New Hampshire, he did seem to be gaining some steam. His rallies were rather successful. He was showing some good poll numbers. So he's going to make the strategic decision to skip Iowa altogether, not spend any time there, not spend any money there, and just say I'm going to focus on hoping to win New Hampshire. I'm going to put my time and money there. If I don't get the momentum from a good Iowa showing, I'm going to take that risk. I'm going to take that chance and let the others kind of battle each other there and hope that New Hampshire could be where my fortunes are going to make or break. Now, there are those who thought that Bill Bradley, should maybe make that same decision because he was in a similar situation where his poll numbers looked a lot better in New Hampshire than they did in Iowa. But Bradley is going to decide not to do what McCain did. He's going to decide to soldier on in the Hawkeye State and try to win there, and and then try to follow that up with perhaps another win in New Hampshire. So we have the Iowa caucuses on January 24th, and George W. Bush is going to win that caucus, and he's going to win with 41% of the vote. Steve Forbes is going to come in second with 30.5%, and that's showing, well, you can look at it as fairly respectable. If we looked at other years, certain states 30% would have been enough to win or at least get close, but he's going to be more than 10 points behind Bush, so it's not close enough to really kind of get the momentum that he really needed and that he really wanted. So it's gonna be, I guess, good enough for him to stay in the race, but it's not going to be enough for him to really pick up enough steam to do well in later states. So Alan Keyes is going to be in third place with 14%. Gary Bauer in fourth place with a little over 8%. Now, John McCain, like I said, he had skipped Iowa, but he nonetheless got 4.5% of the vote there. And Orrin Hatch is going to get 1% of the vote there. And that poor showing by Orrin Hatch in Iowa is going to prompt him to drop out of the race. Al Gore is going to have a convincing win in Iowa. It's almost going to be 2-1. Gore is going to get 63% of the vote, and Bill Bradley is going to get 36.5% of the vote. So Gore picks up 29 delegates, Bradley 18 delegates. So it wasn't the showing that it would help Bradley to get momentum. He did spend some time there. Now, if you look at it as in the delegate count, had he not run, he might not have gotten those 18 delegates, but he really needed to to do better in order to gain some steam because he was behind nationally. So you want to do better in these earlier states, and this showing by Bradley in Iowa isn't going to help him get the momentum he needs later on. And then we have the New Hampshire primary on February 1st, and John McCain is going to win New Hampshire convincingly. So he decides to skip Iowa, and it doesn't hurt him at all. He was able to maintain his support in New Hampshire and win there with 48.5% of the vote. So it's it's about an 18-point lead over Bush, who comes in second with 30.5% of the vote. So this is going to get John McCain a lot of attention. It's going to help him get momentum. He was expected to probably win, but not with this kind of convincing lead. So it certainly helps him as he kind of defies expectations and does better than what people thought. So So his decision to skip Iowa certainly seemed to be the better one with these results. Steve Forbes is going to come in a distant third with 12.5% of the vote, and then we have Alan Keyes with 6.5%, and Gary Bauer just under 1%. Democrats are also going to hold their New Hampshire primary on February 1st. And just like with Iowa, Al Gore is going to win, but New Hampshire is going to be a lot closer, 50% to 45.5%. So it's a pretty close race. Bill Bradley almost made it to first, but it just a few points separated them. Al Gore ended up winning. Now, were those who suggested that if Bill Bradley had done the same thing John McCain did, skipped Iowa, had focused on New Hampshire, been able to, put the time and the money in, maybe he could have won there. It's hard to say. These kind of counterfactuals, we don't know, if that strategy would have worked for Bradley as well as it did for McCain, or, maybe if he did narrowly win in New Hampshire, if that would have brought him the momentum needed to win in other places. But as it stands, Bradley's going to fall a little bit short in the Granite State. So then we have the Delaware primary, which is going to be February 8th, and Bush is going to bounce back here with a rather decisive win, getting 51% of the vote to John McCain's 25.5. Now, Delaware had been a state in 1996 that Steve Forbes had won, which gave his campaign a bit of a jolt that year, and he hoped that the same thing would happen again in 2000, but it was not to be. Not only wouldn't Forbes win, but he'd get third place and a rather distant third, a good 6 points behind John McCain. And McCain had been rather far behind George W. Bush, about 25% of the vote there. So Forbes' campaign is going to be reeling here. And the other campaign that's going to, end actually during this Delaware primary will be Gary Bauer, as we see him getting 0.5% of the vote. Now, I'll talk about Gary Bauer a bit. Now, as I said, he had been in Evangelical Baptist, and he did, I guess, okay in Iowa, which also had a fair amount of Evangelical Baptist voters. Did poorly in New Hampshire, that didn't have as many. Now, Delaware did have some, but he was only able to get 0.5% of the vote, as it seemed like Bush seemed to be winning over those voters. Now, after this race, Gary Bauer is actually going to drop out and not endorse Bush, but he's going to actually endorse John McCain. And one of the reasons cited for that is Bush had given a speech to an institution called Bob Jones University. Now, Bob Jones University had been led by evangelicals, the likes of which Bush and Bauer were both allied with. But the Bob Jones University was said to be something of splitters, where they had been discriminatory against Jewish people and Catholics over the years. And Gary Bauer was more of a lumper, uh, and he did not like that Jones University had been, sort of discriminatory against these other groups that he wanted to build bridges with and be more allied with. So he didn't really like Bob Jones University and their leaders, and he felt like Bush, by platforming them and giving a speech with on their or being platformed by them and giving a speech at their university, was something that he didn't take too kindly for. So he ends up endorsing John McCain, that he said he had gotten along rather well with him during the course of the campaign, and perhaps that could help McCain later on. And then with the Democratic primary in Delaware, we're going to see Al Gore winning there, not as decisively as his Iowa win, but a little bit stronger of a lead than his New Hampshire win. He's going to get 57% to Bill Bradley's 40%. And you also will see up there a third candidate, Lyndon LaRouche, who I haven't really talked about. And I'll just say a little bit about him now. And he did not get a ton of national attention. He was, something of a lower tier candidate, or considered to be. But I, at this time in 2000, lived very close to New Hampshire, and I was in New Hampshire a lot. So I did occasionally see some Lyndon LaRouche road signs, and did see some of his ads on TV. Apparently, he had been a figure who had started out in the far left, but then evolved over time, and had, at this point, he was said to have taken some far right positions. Now, I don't claim to be a Lyndon LaRouche expert by any means, so I'm not going to pretend to be or talk too much about him, but he did have a little little bit of a presence in the race. And kind of later on, as the primaries are going to be essentially over, but there'll still be some states kind of holding late contests, he's actually going to score high enough in some of those later states to actually win some delegates. But the Democratic Party establishment is going to refuse to seat those delegates because they're going to see Lyndon LaRouche as too much of a fringe figure. So, kind of an interesting story that, again, I don't really have time to go into now, but if people are interested and or in the comment section want to share any knowledge they might have about Lyndon LaRouche and his political journey, it'd be, maybe an interesting thing to learn more about. As we move into South Carolina, McCain is going to have some high hopes there. I mentioned that he was a military veteran, and South Carolina is going to be a very pro military, pro veteran state. So he thought that that might be a state well suited for him. It's also going to be a state where there's a lot of evangelical Baptists, and it seemed like Bush had a bit better support amongst them. So it would be up in the air who would win that. McCain hoped he could win, and he had the endorsements of a couple of local congressmen, Lindsey Graham and Mark Sanford, who had both supported McCain, and they were seen as up and coming kind of rising stars of the party during this time. He had also had Gary Bauer's endorsement, so he had really hoped South Carolina would be a turning point. Interestingly enough, I think that when he runs again in 2008, he will win there, and his win in 2008 in South Carolina is going to help his campaign really, kind of solidify things and help him win that year. But here in 2000, he's going to come up short. He's going to lose to Bush by about 9 points, with Alan Keyes coming in third. So it's not going to be enough, and I think that that is going to kind of deflate things on, John McCain's overall campaign. So things will turn around somewhat for McCain on February 2nd as we have the Arizona and Michigan primaries. Now, in the case of Arizona, it is McCain's home state, so it wasn't too much of a surprise that he won there and won pretty decisively. What was a bigger surprise, though, is Michigan. People did not think that McCain was going to win Michigan. He had not won some of those earlier states like Delaware, so it was thought that Michigan might be Bush's for the taking. But McCain would end up getting a pretty impressive win in Michigan with 51%, an 8-point lead over Bush. And I think that this, injected some life into McCain's campaign, and it gave him a shot to think that maybe he might win this after all. On February 29th, 3 states are going to hold contests. And maybe McCain thought that he might have a shot in Virginia and Washington state, Virginia being a little like South Carolina, a strong veteran presence, a strong military presence. But like South Carolina, he's going to fall short there. Bush's support amongst evangelicals is going to help him quite a bit there. And so it'll be a 9-point win for Bush in Virginia. Now, Washington state is a little bit less evangelical, and McCain had thought that maybe his more reform-minded messaging might help him there. But I don't think he was able to spend enough money there, spend enough time there, organize enough there, and Bush is going to end up beating McCain 58-39. Perhaps Bush's stronger organization with more of an establishment backing might have helped him there in a state where neither candidate had as much time to really focus on, and the media didn't focus on it as much. And then Bush is going to have a rather decisive win indeed in North Dakota, which is going to be more suited to, the more evangelical state, a more socially conservative state. So Bush ends up with a decisive win in North Dakota. So having won all 3 of those states on February 29th is going to put Bush in a very good position coming off his losses in Michigan and Arizona earlier. And Bill Bradley had hoped that, Washington could be the state where he turns things around, but it was not to be. He's going to end up losing to Gore. And again, it's almost like a 2-1 victory, Gore beating Bradley 65-34. And then we're going to have Super Tuesday, where both parties are going to have large numbers of primaries and caucuses. The Democrats are going to have 16 contests. The Republicans are going to have 13 contests. In the case of the Democrats, Al Gore is going to sweep all of the states that have contests on Super Tuesday. Now, George W. Bush is not going to sweep all the states. McCain is going to win some states. He's going to win Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Vermont. So there's a good New England faction there that is going to go with McCain. He had won New Hampshire earlier, so 5 of the 6 New England states are going to go with McCain. The only one Bush ends up winning is Maine, where his family had a kind of a long time summer residence there. So he had some local connections there and was able to eke out a slight victory over McCain in Maine. But just winning those 4 New England states and not winning anywhere else, and there were lots of other states that had contests, it was seen as not good enough for McCain, and he did not think at that point it was worth continuing on. So he's going to drop out shortly after these primaries, and Bill Bradley is also going to drop out shortly after these primaries, and it's going to essentially end the primaries and make it so that Bush is going to be the de facto nominee of the Republicans and Al Gore is going to be the de facto nominee of the Democrats. So I think I'm going to conclude part 1 of the 2000 series here, and I'm going to come back with part 2 next week and discuss the Reform Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and what they were up to during this time. And then we'll talk about the general election and what happens there.